All right, good afternoon. The Secretary General this morning spoke at the Africa Dialogue 2018 on the partnerships between the African Union and the United Nations. He said that Africa today is driving its own agenda, with countries growing more prosperous and regions becoming more integrated. The Secretary General said that the historic agreement between Ethiopia and Eritrea is creating opportunities to consolidate peace across the Horn of Africa. He stressed that the UN believes that African leadership to solve African problems, and that the organization is fully committed to working closely with the African Union in solidarity with respect to seize the vast potential of today's opportunities. The Secretary General pointed to the two agreements signed in the past 18 months, the framework on implementing the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and Agenda 2063, and the UN-AU framework on enhanced partnership in peace and security as the foundations of our renewed cooperation. Both of these are based on ensuring women's leadership and gender equalities in all areas, he said, pointing to a very important moment with the creation of the new government of Ethiopia, which enjoys full gender parity. The Secretary General's remarks are available online. And as you saw, the Special Envoy for Syria, Stéphane de Mistura, told Security Council today that the government of Syria has invited him to Damascus next week. This is a follow-up to the meeting with the Secretary General during the General Assembly. Mr. de Mistura said he plans to engage them on the work that has been done on the Constitutional Committee, and also intends before the end of the month to invite the Astana guarantors for consultations in Geneva. He expressed the hope to be in a position to issue invitations to convene the Constitutional Committee, hopefully during the month of November. The Special Envoy said the UN has done all it can to find a way to convene a credible and balanced Constitutional Committee. He added that the UN is ready to do more in an accelerated way during the forthcoming month, taking advantage of the Idlib window of opportunity. But he added he would not convene a committee that is not credible or balanced. Mr. de Mistura, as you saw, also informed Council members that he intends to step down from his post as Special Envoy by the end of next month, after serving four years and 4 months on the job. Mr. de Mistura intends to talk to you at the stakeout after the briefing here is done and after the meeting is completed. On the subject of Mr. de Mistura's departure, the Secretary General will be initiating consultations immediately to find a successor to his Special Envoy with a view of submitting a name to the Security Council. Of course, the Secretary General deeply appreciates the work that Mr. de Mistura has done during his time as the Special Envoy. Throughout his tenure, Mr. de Mistura has kept the interest of the Syrian people first and foremost in his mind, and the values of the UN have underpinned every decision he has taken. And also yesterday, I was asked about the transit of humanitarian goods between Jordan and Syria. For now, the UN humanitarian deliveries are not taking place from Jordan into Syria. Since the change in control in southern Syria, deliveries through the UN Security Council authorized cross-border mechanism have not been possible. We issued this morning a statement on the Comoros, in which the Secretary General expressed his concern over reports of heightened tensions on the island of Anjouan and calls for all concerned to exercise calm and utmost restraint in the interest of peace and stability in the Comoros. The Secretary General exhorts all Comorian political actors to return to the inter-Comorian dialogue, which began under the facilitation of the African Union High Representative, Ramtan Lamamra, and urges the government, political parties, and civil society organizations to implement the confidence-building measures agreed to in support of an inclusive dialogue process. And today, the UN Fund for Population, the UNFPA, launched its annual State of the World Population Report entitled The Power of Choice, Reproductive Rights and Demographic Transition. The report shows the global trends towards smaller families is a reflection of people making reproductive choices to have as few or as many children as they want, when they want. It also shows that the power to choose the number and timing and spacing of children can bolster economic and social development. And UNHCR and the UN Migration Agency today urged European leaders to address this year's record rate of drownings. If somebody can check the lights before we go completely dark. Who is doing that? All right. Can you come? Great. Linda, please. Thank you. Your presence usually brings up the light. I'm surprised by your dimming impact. All right. Okay. I think we need to put him back up. We're good? Excellent. All right. Today, UNHCR and the IOM, the International Organization for Migration, urged European leaders to address this year's record rate of drowning in the Mediterranean Sea. Their appeal comes ahead of this week's meeting of European Union heads of states and governments to discuss the issue. The High Commissioner for Refugee, Filippo Grandi, and the Director General of the IOM, Antonio Vitorino, today warned the political discourse concerning refugees and migrants has become dangerously toxic in some countries, even at a time when arrivals to Europe are declining. This narrative is stoking unnecessary fears, they said. They also called on leaders to focus on the implementation of the Valletta Political Declaration and Plan of Action, which seeks to address the root causes of displacement. And yesterday, I was asked about Guatemala not renewing visas for some staff members of the Commission Against Impunity. The Secretary General expresses his concern upon learning of the decision by the Foreign Ministry not to renew the visas of the staff members of the Commission. The agreement establishing the Commission calls on the government of Guatemala to provide the Commission with all assistance necessary for the discharge of its function and activities. Some of those affected by this decision have an important role in fighting impunity. We're in touch with the Guatemalan authorities to discuss the situation. And today is the International Day for the Eradication of Poverty. This year's theme is coming together with those furthest behind to build an inclusive world of universal respect for human rights and dignity. And in just a little bit, at 12:45, in the visitors' lobby, the Secretary General will take part in the commemoration of the day, where he will highlight the progress made since the day was first observed 25 years ago. Since then, 1 billion people have been lifted out of poverty. However, many still are left behind. The Secretary General will also call on governments to implement policies that promote inclusive growth and respect for human rights. And on our honor roll, we say thank you to Oman, which brings the who've paid their dues in full, which brings us up to 145. After I'm done, you'll hear from Monica. Then at 1:15, Idris Jazari, the Special Rapporteur on the negative impact of unilateral coercive measures on the enjoyment of human rights, will brief you. And then we expect the ambassadors of Belgium, France, Germany, Italy, Netherlands, Poland, Sweden, and the UK to brief the Security Council stakeout following the consultations on Syria. And tomorrow our guest will be Biense Gawanas, the Special Advisor on Africa, who will brief you on the Africa Dialogue series. And at 1:15, there'll be a briefing by Suela Janina, the Chair of the Committee on Enforced Disappearances, and Bernard Duhem, Chair of the Working Group on Enforced or Involuntary Disappearances. Mr. Abadi.
Thank you, Stéphane. The Special Envoy to Syria, Mr. de Mistura, as you announced, is leaving. This is the third departure after Kofi Annan, Brahimi Lakhadar, and now de Mistura. What makes them leave? The difficulty of the task or personal needs?
Well, each left for different reasons. Mr. Annan, I think, laid it out very clearly in an op-ed the time of his leaving. Mr. Brahimi laid out his decisions very clearly as well. And Mr. de Mistura said it very directly. It was for personal reasons. I think more than 4 years in this post is a long time for anyone, and obviously it's not as long for the people of Syria who have continued to suffer for almost 8 years. But I can't stress enough the appreciation that the Secretary General feels towards the work that Mr. de Mistura has done.
But Mr. Annan stayed only 5 months, 6 months.
Yeah.
Thank you, Stéphane. About on Yemen, as you know, last Monday there was this horrific attack on the buses and so forth. I mean, my question is, all these incidents keep on multiplying, and there's a promise of investigation, and nothing is ever revealed. Is there any investigation worthwhile which has come to any conclusion about the killings that are going on in Yemen? And we know it is being done by the Saudi coalition.
I think we have condemned and expressed our concerns at these horrific incidents. I think the Secretary General has laid out his point of view directly in his reports to the Security Council, as well as through the report on children in armed conflict. And our focus continues to be both on finding a political solution and on alleviating the humanitarian suffering of the Yemeni people.
I mean, that is happening, but what is not happening is determination made by any of the independent organizations as to who is doing this, or at least naming and shaming them for doing.
As I said, I would refer you to what the Secretary General has said in the past. Yes, sir.
Thanks, Stéphane. Could you please comment on the controversy over the participation of two senior UN officials in an event last night that was backed by Saudi Arabia in the light of the disappearance of the journalist Jamal Khashoggi?
What event you're referring to?
Sure. The two individuals were Mary Rudil, head of the UNESCO office in New York, and Robert Skinner, executive director of the UN Office for Partnerships, at an event called the Arab Art and Education Initiative at the Asia Society.
Yeah, I think my understanding is that the event was sponsored by the Asia Society. On the case of Mr. Khashoggi, we'll reiterate this, the Secretary General continues to be following this very closely. He's very concerned about the lack of information. He looks forward to some clarity being made as to what has happened.
So the participation of two UN officials in an event that is as part of a festival that is funded and backed by Saudi Arabia was sanctioned, even though it's a sensitive time.
My understanding is that this was an event being held at the Asia Society. Yes, sir.
Thank you, Stéphane. Does Secretary General have any comment on possible consultation on Myanmar's human rights violation at Security Council?
Obviously, this is up for the Security Council members to decide what they want to put on the agenda, how they want to discuss it. As you'll recall now, I think over a year ago, the Secretary General had written what was almost an unprecedented letter to the Security Council expressing his concern about what was going on in Myanmar and encourage him to discuss the situation. It has been discussed in the past, but the Secretary General will it's up to the members of the Security Council to decide on what topics they want to broach, and obviously we always remain available to brief as requested. Linda, and then we'll go.
Thank you, Steph. Apropos of Mr. de Mistura, I know there have been rumors the last few months that he was interested in perhaps leaving, and I was just wondering, I know you can't give me direct information, but about how far into the process of finding a successor? I know you mentioned that the SG was initiating the process, but traditionally, about how far in advance will a successor, do you think, be mentioned?
Well, obviously, ideally, we would not want to see any gap in leadership in the office of the special envoy. So we are working hard in initiating consultations with member states with a view of putting it to the Security Council. It's hard to predict how long the process will take, because obviously it's not just up to us, it's also up to the reaction we get from member states. But the Secretary General is very keen on getting that process done as quickly as possible to ensure that there is no gap, and if there is unfortunately a gap, that is be as short as possible for such an important and critical office, especially as Mr. de Mistura said, he is really focusing on the Constitutional Committee and getting the parties back, the Astana parties back to Geneva. Sorry, yes.
Thank you, Stéphane. My question is about yesterday's very strong protest by Cuban diplomats in ECOSOC chamber. I have two questions. Number one is, after the event, there have been any kind of communication from U.S. mission to UN Secretariat, like complaint or consultation or request? And number two is, what is the USG's stance about yesterday's strong protest in the chamber? Thank you.
Look, the rules for holding public meetings in the UN are public. They have to be consistent with the purposes and principles of the UN, that it be non-commercial in nature, and that meeting was clearly non-commercial in nature, as the U.S. permanent mission certified. The sponsoring mission must certify that the case that the meeting is within the purposes and principles of the UN. The sponsoring mission in any meeting is responsible for the content and conduct of the meeting. I mean, we saw what happened, and I will leave it at that. Mr. Abadi, then Masood.
Thank you, Stéphane. Is the Secretary General planning to attend the Investment Initiative Conference in Saudi Arabia?
No, I'm not aware that he was invited, nor does he have any plan to attend.
Yes, Stéphane, I know you've been responding on Mr. Adnan, Mr. Jamal Khashoggi's killing over there in Istanbul. The Turkish authorities have just said that they have tape recording of his killing, and they know it can be determined that who killed him. Now, will that tape be maintained and used at the United Nations investigation at all?
No, I'm not aware of a UN investigation into the case. I mean, we're reading press reports like you are, but there is no UN investigation underway in this case. Monica, it is up to you now to save the day. Yeah.